All right. I'm really excited to have you here to have an interview with Arthur Brook. I don't want to say CEO of Holo because I've heard a couple of times that you don't want to be mentioned that way.
Well, acting CEO sort of at the moment, but
Yeah. Okay. Yes, it was. This conversation will cover topics around cryptocurrencies, internet, communities, and money, and definitely I will talk about the projects you are going that you are having at the moment with Holo and Holochain. But I want to start with a fundamental question: what is money to you?
for me, money is a medium of exchange currency. Um, I don't mean to redirect your question, but for me, what is currency is the much more interesting question because we kind of redefine that in our scope. Where we're really, English in English, those two words are kind of used interchangeably, and we're trying to reclaim currency more to its Latin roots. Correre, to run or to flow. It's about currents see, right? The ability to see flows, the symbol systems that we make to be able to coordinate flows on large scales. And that includes reputation currencies and many other things that are not necessarily money or monetary currency. Money is a small part of that larger picture.
Okay. Since you've already mentioned that, do you think it's a good idea to use other currencies for exchange? If, for example, there are currencies that use time in exchange for work, and that is value to whatever you think is valuable to you. And I already have some examples where I know that in the world, people use other different currencies, not money, but use them as currencies. So
Yeah, I think I would go so far as to be extremely heretical, be quite a heretic about money and say, I think that where we are headed is actually fundamentally to a post-monetary economy. That information age economies are not monetary economies, and that's where we're headed, into things that are driven more by measures and metrics and reputation and trust rather than money as a substitute for trust, right? I will gladly give you this phone if you give me $1,000. Well, then I don't have to trust you. I'm the money ends up being a substitute for trusting you, and I think part of what we're doing in an information age is building much stronger, wider, scalable networks of information flows, including what we can trust from whom, and that those things will start to replace money. There are certainly other types of medium of exchange and monetary currencies like time banking and time dollars. And I am all for people breaking out of kind of the narrow mindset of money and exploring the landscape of choices that are available to them in configuring currencies, because I think it's actually a really rich field of choices.
okay, I want to break it down a little bit for people who are not completely familiar with, even people who are not completely familiar with blockchain technology. Can you give an example of this reputation-based currency that you were?
Sure. I mean, this is an example I use a bunch, but a college degree is a reputation currency. It reputes that you've achieved a particular level of learning in a particular domain. It makes, for example, hiring in the job space a lot more simplified, right? Like, you want to make sure if you're going to have somebody build this bridge that they have the right kind of background in structural engineering to understand how to make it safe. And being able to have this shorthand of a degree, an advanced degree in structural engineering or something like that, is very useful for being able to target people for the job. Can you imagine if you had to, in hiring, if you had to actually completely determine for yourself the level of expertise somebody had by interrogating them about that whole domain? Well, what if you don't have enough expertise to determine their expertise, right? Like, so these are very useful things that we use to track flows, right? A flow of education occurred. And if you think about it, the college degree you earn by getting these credits, right? You have 25 credits in this domain and 12 credits of this and 15 credits of that. The credits are a unit of account currency that show how many course hours you've spent in different domains. But the credits only count if you get a good enough grade. And the grades are a performance metric currency attempting to measure how well you're learning the content of the course.
Mm-hmm.
And you divide up the power in the university by who gets to issue which currencies. The professors issue the grades, the departments issue the credits, the university issues the degree. And then the whole flow of education of students, they navigate with these three non-monetary currencies. We use these things all over the place. We just don't recognize that they're currencies.
Okay. Okay. The first image when I hear this that comes to my mind is a Black Mirror-esque kind of reputation system where you only want to be judged for all the positive things that you're doing, and you don't show any negative sides of you, which will create a superficial society.
Yeah, what I think most of the sort of Black Mirror-esque, the dark images around reputation currency come from actually how dehumanizing monetary currency is, right? How when we get treated as a number, and how one-dimensional that is, because it is one-dimensional. But when you understand that reputation currencies are not necessarily one-dimensional, right? There are many different types of degrees in different domains from different issuers, different universities. You know, you can have badges that identify different skills and achievements in different domains. That, you know, like, it isn't about numbers. The whole thing of pretending that currency is just about tradable units is not only dehumanizing, it's actually destructive to the health of natural living systems. And it's part of how we're eroding and depleting the whole planet, is by trying to turn everything into monetary numbers. And so for me, part of when I say that I think we're moving toward a post-monetary economy is that it's part of us taking responsibility for the richer information that just can't be reduced down to numbers, that is relational and deeper information that we need for sustaining the planet and societies and cultures and communities.
Okay. Is that what you're working on with Holo, that you're creating these kind of reputation systems too?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We don't talk about this side of it much with Holo because it's a crypto domain project where people's view of what that is tends to be more narrow. But truthfully, Holo is designed as a transitional currency. It actually can run on a monetary currency or on reputation. So Holo, just to back up one moment, Holochain is our blockchain alternative for truly scalable distributed computing systems. Holo is, Holochain doesn't have a currency in it. Most blockchain applications build the currency into the base protocol. We would suggest that's a mistake. It's like, you don't want to build the currency into the internet protocol. You want many currencies to be able to run on top of it, right? So Holochain doesn't have a currency and doesn't need a currency. It's so efficient that you don't need to incent people to run their instance of the Holochain app. They run that instance of the Holochain app because they want to use the app, and then they get to control and own their data. You don't need to pay people to own their data. You know, it's like Dropbox doesn't pay you to keep a copy locally of your files. You know, like so the reason that people think you need to give people an incentive is actually because of how terribly inefficient blockchain is. It wastes so much energy and electricity and processing power that you need to reward people to do all that wasting. Holo is a bridge back to mainstream browsers from like Holochain's sort of perfect futuristic peer-to-peer space, because not everybody's ready to install next-gen crypto apps. they just want to be able to like type a web address into their browser and expect to access things. Well, you can do that with Holo by some people hosting virtual Holochain space for people who are not running Holochain yet. And that's something that they get paid for. That's where the currency then comes into play, is that we do have a service model that runs on top of Holochain, where you're actually providing a service and there's accounting for that service and then payment and reward for it. But one of the things that you can do also with Holochain is operate on your sharing ratio. You know, you can kind of think of it like your BitTorrent sharing ratio, so that you don't have to pay others to service you, but because you provide so much service, they actually do that for the reward on their sharing ratio as well. So we built it purposely as a hybrid so that we can, it can actually weather the transitions as we go from monetary to post-monetary economies.
That's very interesting. I have a couple of questions to that that I want to dig into a little bit later. But before, also regarding this, I want to dig into the meta currency project. This is something that you founded around 12, 13 years ago, if I'm right.
Yeah.
And I have a quote here that I found very interesting. If we want technology to be actually solve problems, it can't recreate the same imbalances found in our economic system.
Right.
I can see a lot of parallels to then later the projects, what you did with Holochain and probably also with Scepter. Can you explain your own definition, what you mean by this?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people tend to be kind of techno-optimists, right? Like, we're just going to invent the next technology that's going to magically solve our problems. And if you don't get that a lot of the economic problems that we have really come from core underlying power imbalances, like who gets to issue the money, for example, right?
Good question.
And if so, many people started building alternative currency systems, but they were centralized alternative currency systems, or what the way we would actually phrase this a little more precisely is they were enclosable, because we have this distinction, enclosable or unenclosable, because centralized, decentralized, distributed is all a little fuzzy. People seem to be confused about exactly what that means. And what we saw in the metacurrency project was, if you just make another centralized currency system, but you change who gets to issue the money, well, you only think you made this change, because actually the people who control the system can change the rules and make it so that they get to issue the money. So you're just going to turn the world over from the bankers to the geekers, you know, like you just, the system admins then get to run the world. And any inherent power imbalance built into those low levels, where somebody can basically enclose some of the protocol or information flow, then they get to control the protocol or information flow. And it may not start off with any kind of ill intent, but that becomes a weakness, a weak point that can be abused. And so early in the early days of the metacurrency project, we were talking about open rules, open protocols, open transport, and open identity as like the four components. And we even saw open was too sort of had too many interpretations, that we really came to this thing about enclosability. And what I mean by that, if I can actually just talk for a moment, can I go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
So what we mean by that is it actually has to do with the communication medium. So when we're sitting around in a group together and I want to say something to you, right, the carrier that I'm using are sound waves in the air. And the person sitting next to me, if they don't like what I'm about to say, they can't grab my words out of the air and stop you from hearing them. It's an unenclosable carrier. Nobody's controlling the carrier that is the airwaves that the sound is going on. Now, somebody might try screaming louder than me, or right, you can create some interference, but you can't control it.
Right.
If I write you a message, though, and I pass it to you, or I send it via messenger, by horseback, or whatever, right? That message can be intercepted. That carrier, that piece of paper, is now enclosable. We're recording a call right now. You're running the recording, right? You get to choose what happens to it. You could edit it and make it sound like I'm saying something that I'm not, or something, right? Like it's an enclosable carrier that's going to be under your control, and when you can actually build unenclosable carriers, they're not subject to central control. And that's really the point of Holochain. And I really think that that's the point of blockchain that most people have missed, because they're all, sparkly-eyed about tokens and money. They aren't really getting that the power of blockchain is we can hold data in a way collectively that it can't be tampered with. We've created an unenclosable data space, basically, that no one person can intercept or control.
Yeah.
And that's where there's some real power.
That's very interesting, yes. And if we're thinking about the model that you originally wanted to create with the metacurrency project, this is one of the problems that you wanted to solve. What is the key factors for founding the metacurrency project? You talk a lot about the creation of a better system. You're using the word deep wealth. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So we have some pictures of wealth as not just being about a bank account balance, but about being the wellness of the whole, the collective wealth, the common wealth. It's interesting. Again, English has some weird things in it, like the verb to heal and health, and the verb to wheel, to make better, and wealth. It's actually connected to wellness. The origins of that word are, yet we've taken it in a very personal, isolated way, as if it's about my bank account balance. But I think we can see that some of these patterns of just acquisition, of trying to get more for myself, are having system-wide negative side effects. When a company is doing that and dumping radioactive waste, or different things like that, there's negative side effects involved in that narrow view of just my own personal acquisition. And what we're trying to do with the metacurrency project is to actually build a living systems model of wealth that can look at wealth across all of these boundaries and layers and levels. And one of the things that emerges from that are currencies that need to be able to operate at these different layers and levels and across different types of boundaries, or being able to be constrained to different types of boundaries. And understanding the reason for all of those different types of currencies, and stop sort of the kind of automatic pattern of wanting one currency to rule them all, like trying to boil everything down to one set of numbers. It's extremely reductionistic and tends to break the health of systems. And so in the metacurrency project, we really wanted to be able to see what are these dynamics of restoring this deep wealth for living systems, what are the kinds of currencies involved, and what are the kinds of tools needed to run those currencies. And that's where you mentioned earlier Scepter. That's where Scepter came from. For us, that's kind of like rebuilding the computing stack for the next leap in collective intelligence that we need as a species.
Okay. I would like to if you're okay with that, go a little bit into back in time to when you guys founded the project, and what were your personal motivations? Why did you decide to? What was the current problem that you saw that you realized? Okay, there's something that we need to fix, or that we possibly can fix to make the world, for the term I say, a better place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I'm just going to speak personally of
Yes,
me.
please.
I had been running, I'd been starting and creating businesses that were really designed to be self-organizing businesses. That I was really focused on a kind of rich human culture, high levels of accountability and transparency and autonomy, where people kind of managed themselves. We didn't have managers. We had coaches, but we also had these funny performance metric systems where we could see what people were accountable for and how they were doing in accountability. And that's part of why you didn't need a boss, is that we made a system for making these things visible. And I read this book by Bernard Lietaer in 2001 called The Future of Money. And it kind of talked about how the money system that we have is not the only choice. It's a choice we made, and it has become a social hack. The artificial scarcity that's built into it, and all these different things have made us think that scarcity is real. It's made us think that these different human behaviors are real. But then there's these other options, and there's new movement of complementary currencies emerging. And Bernard's view was still very money focused. But what I saw was that all these tools that we'd been building in our self-organizing companies and that kind of stuff, they were also these kinds of culture hacks. They were also these kinds of feedback loops, and they were currencies. They were ways that we made of being able to see the flows that we had to manage as a whole. And it shifted my thinking in terms of like, where is the leverage point for being able to make change? All of these companies out there optimize themselves to the incentives given to them. If you can change the currency, all of these companies will optimize themselves to that as the new incentive, and it just became a big leverage point for being able to make change and understand it at this deeper level, that it's not only money. It's really about the patterns of flows and health that we actually can weave together. And so for me, that's where MetaCurrency's roots started, was from running software companies this way, sort of agile, self-organizing software companies, and realizing that this was even a greater leverage point for social change, where you can literally do social and culture hacking with currencies.
Okay. So you had a rough idea back then when was there a moment when you said, okay, I know exactly where I want to go now, or what system works better, and this is how I do it?
Well, not exactly like that, because I think it's kind of like biological diversity. There isn't one perfect organism. You need a bunch of different systems. You don't want one currency. You want to create the capacity, the evolutionary capacity to spawn many of them. And so I think of it a little bit like the kind of the Cambrian explosion of life forms that emerged with DNA, right? Where there was like all of these new multicellular life forms, lots of experiments, and most of them died. Many of them were not necessarily useful experiments, but part of how we found the ones that have stuck around is by trying lots of options. I feel like we're actually on that kind of cusp right now with currencies, that when you have something like Holochain and Scepter that can give you an unenclosable carrier to try many different organizational models, many different approaches to building wealth and measurement and feedback loops and resource flows, that there's going to be this explosion of new patterns of how we organize ourselves, many of which will die, but almost all of which will be more efficient than or more adaptive rather, than the command and control brittle hierarchies that we're used to running in the industrial age.
Okay.
The world is just changing too fast. And those types of structures are not going to be able to keep up. And these self-organizing structures are going to kind of be the next generation of them. And we sort of feel like we're unleashing this new social DNA of ways of organizing ourselves on collective levels.
Yes, the world is moving too fast, but in some other ways we have been using structures that we haven't changed for many years. And one of the things that you already mentioned is our monetary system, how we use currencies at the moment. And I think when I think about the currencies, or at the moment, the rise of the blockchain currency, which came and changed a lot, I think a lot about the shorting of the subprime bubble back when it happens in 2007. The current crypto scenes is very much like that ecosystem that attracted variant people who have nothing to lose from disrupting the status quo. We got a lot of libertarians and unemployed macro hedge fund managers. There's a good quote that I like here. The future is disorder. A door like this has cracked open 5 or 6 times since we got up on our hind legs. It is the best possible time to be alive when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong. So when we take this to the cryptocurrency community that we have here, Bitcoin could be a bubble, yes, but it could also be a change in how we use and organize human activity at the level of the internet, or it could be both. At the same time, we have the German bank, which said that a crash of Bitcoin could be a major risk for the global economy. What is your take on this? Do you worry about the hype? What do you think about the technology, and do you agree with my point?
Yes, I would assert it's both a bubble and a game changer, right? Like that the pattern of decentralized systems, the intention, what people want and what people think that blockchain is going to get them, the aspirations of blockchain are good. The delivery of it in the package we have is fundamentally inadequate. We can come back to some of the reasons why I think that is. I think there's some core fallacies, actually.
Okay, please. I'd actually be very interested in that from your perspective. But well, yeah, you can also come back to that later.
I can do it quickly now if you want. So,
cool.
To me, the 2 core fallacies that blockchain and most distributed computing is organized around right now is that data exists and time exists.
Okay.
What I mean by that is that data has an independent existence, some independent universal existence. Like you have the scientists, Trump get elected, and you have the scientists scrambling to try to make sure that climate data gets saved so that we, whatever. But climate data, let's look at. So what's the temperature of the room that you're in right now?
20, maybe 20 degrees.
20 degrees Celsius. So now, is that true over by the windows? What about under that hot light behind you?
Of course.
Is there one temperature in that room? If you had a device that you were measuring it with, you could measure different temperatures in different places. Then you might even find out the device that you're using is out of calibration, and that's off by a certain percentage reliably. Like all we have, I would assert that the temperature doesn't exist as a piece of data. What really exists is a reading by a particular sensor asserted in a particular sequence of readings, in a particular time, or sequence, I think is better. And that if you decouple the data from its source, you're lying. You're basically pretending that it is some absolute independent truth, and it's not. If we find out that your sensor was out of calibration, then we could adjust the temperatures by the 10% that the readings were off or whatever, right? And understand that, oh yeah, so we needed to recalibrate it, and now we can true up our data with our ability to measure the calibration of that instrument, which also could be wrong, right? But what this is really about is that all you have is assertions by a particular author or agent from a particular vantage point in a particular sequence. And when we pretend that data has an independent existence, like a coin exists,
right,
we create a problem for ourselves, especially in a distributed system where, well, which coin exists? Has it been spent? Has it, right? Now we have this double spend problem. And so what we do is we throw out everybody's perspective except one, and we create a fiction that person's perspective is the truth, right? So what blockchain does with proof of work is it says whoever finds the nonce first that gives us the the thing that's the hash that starts with the right number of zeros, they win the hash cash lottery, basically, right? The work lottery, and now their vantage point becomes truth.
Okay.
And we throw away all of the other vantage points, and we just have this one, right? And then we do it again, and we do it again, and we're creating this fiction as if there's an absolute truth, instead of actually tracking what are the vantage points. So this is not turning into be a longer explanation than I meant to. Sorry. Let me just go on to.
But I actually find this very interesting.
Yeah. So then the other one is that time exists, that there is such a thing as universal time. Like there isn't. When we talk about doing something at the same time, right? Two people on opposite sides of the planet try to spend this coin at the same time. Well, there isn't even really such a thing as the same time. Everybody's going to receive those transactions in whatever order they did based on the latency from the sender or the sequence of gossip that occurred between nodes. And again, how blockchain solves that problem is it just picks one answer and throws away all the others. It doesn't really resolve the issue of which one came first in a way that we would find makes sense to a human, right?
Okay.
It just randomly picks the winner. And what we're suggesting is that if you don't create this data-centric reality as if data has an independent existence, and instead you create an agent-centric reality where if you and I do a transaction, we're changing my state and we're changing your state. We're not, the state exists in the agents, not in some absolute data list, right? And so I don't need consensus. We don't need consensus from everyone else. We just need to agree that we're changing our state, and then we publish that change and it gets validated by other people as to whether or not we're following the shared rules of the currency. But our state we've completed the transaction. Now others can say whether we're cheating or not, but we just made a signed record of this change. And if we were cheating, now the rest of the network can know they're cheaters and we want to block them. These are malicious nodes that are, not following the rules or whatever. And it just gives you more choice. It gives you more agency, and it gives you no bottlenecks. And so when you start operating from an agent-centric reality, which is, I would assert, how the world works anyway, right? Like, there is no central ledger in my body that all of my cells are reporting to coordinate their state. Each cell embodies its own state.
All right.
That's how things actually operate on scale. And so that's the architecture that we built Holochain on. And but it requires people who have come into this from blockchain to be able to do this kind of inversion in their thinking and get that you can still have a global ledger in the form of an eventually consistent DHT that validates all of the entries and is sharded across, because we already know how to shard DHTs, so we solve the sharding problems, we solve the bottleneck problems, all of these things.
Okay. According to, for example, Vitalik Buterin, he says that the invention of the blockchain is in its early stage, and the idea that they had is finished or is in its first version in 8 years, in 9 years, when they solve the scalability issues, and where they have, I had an interview, for example, with Matthew Schutte, who explained that it's not even possible to have a like button for Facebook on the blockchain at the moment. Right. The capacity that you need at the moment.
Right. There's over 500,000 likes per second on Facebook. Yeah. Right? Like you can do 5 transactions per second on Bitcoin. It's Ethereum's faster, but
it's true. But there are other blockchains that are coming now, and that some of them are already public, that say we're like 5,000 times faster, we're 10,000 times faster. Then we, for example, we have Hashgraph, and they're all in the early stages, but they possibly be much faster and then solve some of these problems. Even when I say blockchain might not be the solution for everything, but it might be useful for some of these things much more than what we have at the moment.
There's certainly progress happening. And if you talk about things like Hashgraph, to me, what's interesting is Hashgraph is a hybrid. It's part way to the agent-centric model. Because what they're doing is, if you look at the way the Hashgraph works, they have their agents in the examples, A, B, C, D, E, right? And they're talking about the order in which agents are receiving information. So they're actually including the vantage point of agents now, where blockchain never does that. Blockchain doesn't do diagrams that actually include the vantage point of agents. And then they're saying that we can look at when different agents receive things, and we can take a median timestamp, and that's what we're going to call the official universal time. So they've made one hard-coded consensus algorithm based on agent perspective information. And what we're suggesting in Holochain is the focus on consensus is mostly wrong, that most data in a distributed application system environment isn't rival data to begin with. We can tweet the exact same thing, and that's not a collision. That's not a problem, right? It's only when you start with rival data, like coins and tokens, and you try to you build your whole computing model around that you think that consensus is at the center of the conversation instead of at the edge of the conversation. So we can run a Twitter app just fine without consensus, except when we try to register a username. If I want my handle to be, kitty cat, and you want your handle to be kitty cat, then we have a collision and we have a conflict to resolve. Now, in Holochain, there's an implicit consensus of, if I registered kitty cat and it has saturated the neighborhood where that hash is, and you come along later and try to register kitty cat, and it tries to go to those nodes, and now there's a collision. It says that name's taken. It bounces back at you. That's easy to resolve. The only time that it's a problem to resolve is if we register it at the same time-ish, and it hasn't had a chance, one of our actions hasn't had a chance to saturate that neighborhood. So this is like, in terms of use case of a distributed Twitter, this is what, 0.00001% of the data or something like that. Do we want to carry the overhead of consensus on all of the rest of that data interaction because, some tiny percentage of the time we might have a collision? I would assert no. We just need to detect that collision and have methods of resolving it, and that the methods of resolving it should not be hard-coded, not if you intend to have a general computational framework. The methods of resolving it should be contextual to the community resolving it. Maybe it triggers an auction and it goes to the highest bidder for the name. Maybe we check on our seniority or our history or our reputation currency, and the person who's contributed the most value to the community over time from their reputation gets the name. Or, or maybe both parties get a message and have to work it out with each other, and that you want to create a culture of cooperation instead of competition. And those things should be the choice of the application developer, not hard-coded into the cryptographic fabric underneath it.
All right. So in a way, you're giving communities the opportunity to create different systems without changing too much, like on a nation state level, let's say that.
Yeah.
I heard the statement before, and I want to hear your point on this. Blockchain solves problems. Holo will solve systems, or Holochain will solve systems.
Was that something Matthew said? That sounds like a...
No. That's like...
I mean, it's certainly, I think, the way that we've approached the design of Holochain is much more from a systems design perspective.
Yeah.
And I think the design of blockchain has emerged more from reacting to particular problems, centralized control of money, for example, and, that kind of thing. It's not fair, I think, to, like, when you look at the sophistication of Patricia trees in Ethereum and that kind of stuff, people have designed some very sophisticated systems. It's not fair to say that they're not bringing some system design principles into it. It's just, I'm not sure that they went down deep enough to challenge some of the underlying assumptions, such that they were already kind of operating inside of a set of constraints that we kind of went down to a lower layer and came up outside of those constraints, which is why our model is more inverted, and I would assert more efficient because of that, because we challenged more of the assumptions at the system design level.
I want to talk more about changing of systems, because that is what the blockchain movement at the moment is all about. We will challenge the status quo, and we will completely disrupt everything, and nothing will be the same as before. And I believe that some of the things will fundamentally change from now on. But do you believe, when we're not talking about your projects, that we will have major implications on smaller communities, for example, on villages, for example, who try to use Holochain as a means for creating systems on their own, or currencies on their own, on a local level? Do you think, is that one of the goals that you want to achieve by creating it?
Very much so. I think part of our approach in Holochain is more ecosystemic, less monolithic. So part of, like, one of the core things about that is that, for example, on Ethereum, every smart contract or dApp runs on one blockchain. In Holochain, every Holochain application is a separate Holochain. It's a separate peer-to-peer address space, a separate DHT ledger, for sharing the information. And obviously every node has its own separate source chains, the immutable source chains that it's using for all of its state changes that it contributes to the system. So that allows for this kind of fractalization into smaller scales much more easily. So we can, for example, run a Holochain-based Slack clone. We can have a group chat, and 30 of us on that team may be in that chat, and it is its own Holochain app. It doesn't need to worry about the bandwidth involved in some big monolithic blockchain. It has become its own little community. And you could have other clones of that running, but then our group might decide, we want some different features. And we could potentially implement some new features and upgrade to a new set of features that involves migrating to new DNA, by the way. That's another conversation, maybe talking about the app upgrade process for distributed apps. But we could have that kind of autonomy to kind of fork off in a different direction than other groups that are using this Slack type system, you know. I think that, combined with the fact that whatever Holochain applications you're running,
Oh. Sorry, the internet connection got disrupted for a second here.
which part? Well, I was just saying that
The last 10 seconds.
Okay, I was saying that when you run applications locally, you can build API bridges between them, which lets you compose between these different chains, these different contexts, very freely. It lets you have kind of some autonomy to, one, build a UI that could talk with many different holochains, or have data cross between holochains. But when it does so under your agency. You're signing that you've done it, right? Like, so,
yeah.
But I think that will create a much better fractal culture at smaller scale and a more creative and composable culture rather than kind of monolithic. We have to figure out how to have this whole blockchain talk to this whole blockchain rather than I'm the bridge here and you're the bridge there, you know?
So if we take this onto an application, let's say we use Facebook. We use Facebook. There are two different versions now. As you said, at the moment we have the data-centric version where Facebook owns all the servers and all the information you give them to Facebook, while with the agent-centric version, you are responsible and you are the owner of all of your data. So you can stop Facebook from using your data. And it's difficult for me to understand this, even though I read the green paper a couple of times. But what are the main differences for a user when switching from a data-centric version to an agent-centric version? Like, how would it look differently when using applications like Facebook, Twitter, Uber, or maybe even voting for governments, something like that?
Well, I want to be a little bit careful about the part about where you're saying that you could sort of stop Facebook from...
Please correct me.
If you have published something to the DHT, you've kind of released it to the wild. You can't take it back. It's a monotonic DHT, meaning it only grows. It can only add information. You can mark something deleted, but it's still there. It's just marked deleted.
Oh, wow.
And that's the only way that we can actually make gossip work. Because if you could delete it, then somebody else is gossiping that it gets created and somebody else is gossiping that it gets deleted, and you get in these gossip loops of creating and uncreating things. And the only way that you can update that is if you actually can mark it deleted.
Okay.
Still, right. So it's a part of the thing about the data integrity architecture is that it's monotonic. The time where you have the opportunity to filter away old data is in the upgrades or updates between apps, right? So between app versions. So we don't necessarily think about how hard it is to deal with distributed software updates, because we're often used to, well, we just updated on the server and now everybody's seeing the new version. But when you're on a truly peer-to-peer system that will only talk with its peers, when you create a new update, one of the things that we've built into Holochain is pluggable governance. We're not finished with the implementation of this yet, but basically there has to be a method of being able to accept an official update to something, which then can notify the community, okay, now you need to install this new version. And for a while, you have both versions running. And the new version can bridge, you can build this API bridge to the old version, and then you can run an update migrate type of process where we can pull whatever data over that we need to, or we can just keep them both running and say, this is my old history. Or, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different options. Or if it's a currency.
Can I ask something? Okay, yeah. Finish the point, yeah.
If it's a currency, maybe you're carrying over your state, your balance, and that type of thing. And then you need like a nice auditing enforcement on an opening entry where you get a bunch of other people that validate that was carried over properly from the old one. So go ahead.
My question really quick was, what might be an example of where an updated version and a split might be useful, or to keep both, or even 3, 4, 5 versions of the same thing?
A bunch. I can think of a bunch of different scenarios. So one is a scenario where the application either didn't have pluggable governance for everybody to know that there's an official update that they should be updating to. So there's no way to make an official update if you don't have the pluggable governance. And so there's a lot of people still operating in the old space, but you want to also be interacting with people in the new space. You run them both. And maybe you create a UI that you type in your tweet and it goes to both versions of Twitter, or, and that's fine. And this one's reached the one in this space, and these tweets reach the one in that space, and that's life. That's one scenario. Another would be it may have pluggable governance, but you have a mutiny. You have an unofficial fork happening. You have part of the community saying, yeah, this hasn't been accepted as an official fork, but we like going in this direction a lot more. And you may like that new community's ideas and want to go play there, but still not be ready to give up the old community's space and want to be able to talk in both spaces, right? So that, I think, is going to be another kind of common scenario. And there may even be versions where what you do is you run your old version for some period of time, months, years, or whatever, because you can't really migrate the data over. In the case of a currency, when we're countersigning transactions and we both sign the transaction, which includes the linking hash to the prior transactions, when I update to a new system, I can't regenerate that transaction with your signature in this new context. Okay. Only you can generate your signature. I could generate my signature. So there's a reason to keep those historical records for the proper provenance of the data.
Okay. I want to go back to the question that I had before where I made a mistake about how it is run. So if we take an example of again, Facebook, Twitter, what might be the main differences for an agent, between an agent and a data-centric approach?
Well, like Twitter, so right now if you download the Holochain alpha releases, it comes with a distributed Twitter app. And,
the Clutter.
It's called Clutter. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not that there's any kind of value judgment about social media there. It's a group of cats, a flock of cats. It's called a clutter, clouder. It's interesting to me that you've got like a group of Facebook fans that want to potentially buy Facebook. They want to raise billions of dollars to buy a company that is running essentially, I would say, legacy technology that doesn't have a revenue model to sustain it. And then they're going to be stuck running all these centralized servers without a revenue model to sustain it. It's like, well, what if you could just carry your own Twitter load as a peer server times a redundancy factor of, say, I don't know, a couple hundred, where you're going to carry the Twitter load of a couple hundred users in your DHT to provide enough redundancy that, that the system can run. Well, most people tweet, like the average tweet amount is 1.1 tweets a day or something like that. So if I have to carry a couple hundred users, that's say 250 tweets a day. Tweets are very small, very small amount of data. In 6 months, that will grow to the size of like one 12 megapixel photo, uncompressed photo. So 6 months of running this Twitter data, I'm now storing the same as one photo that I happen to take on my phone or something. You know, it's a small load when it's divided up well. And there's no reason to pay billions of dollars for running centralized architecture if you can just carry that small load instead.
Is that the same case when we talk about Facebook as, you know, the video and photo platform, or let's say YouTube, which has terabytes of uploads every second?
That's obviously a different case. And we have sort of been avoiding that case in that we've just put in as a recommendation that we recommend you not do large file size type stuff. What we will probably end up needing to do is to build some file sharing type of systems. For one thing, we can just interface with existing things like IPFS. We actually built Holochain in Go using a bunch of the same multi-address libraries and stuff as IPFS, trying to be kind of a friendly cousin project to IPFS, where it's file-oriented and we're more data engine-oriented, database. You could think of it more like a database. So one option would be we offload that to IPFS, to MadeSafe, to one of the other file sharing systems. Another option is that you break the file into parts so that you don't get stuck holding, you know, a 20 gigabyte DVD video file on your phone. You get a little part of it potentially, and we break it into shards and it moves around. But I still think in that scenario, you need to know what you're signing on for. You need to know that you're signing on for that kind of storage. And you know, the other option is that you just publish summary information, and you always have to go back to the source for the big files. But that's not very resilient.
Yeah. So there might be a possibility for a hybrid where you can. And also, I want to add to that question: what do you think if Holo will be successful, Holochain will be successfully implemented? It will not overtake everything, but it will probably have a parallel system. Well, people use Facebook or people use Twitter, and they use Twitter on Holochain parallel. Do you think they will replace them in the long run, or that it will exist parallel?
Well, in the long run, I think Scepter will win with its self-describing protocols because of the information fragmentation problem. Yes, you have this stuff over on Twitter and this stuff over on Facebook, and this, you have your text messages on your phone over here, and you have your voicemails on the system out there, and you have your Skype chats and your Telegram messages and your, you know, like all this different stuff. And then you're like, crap, Matthew gave me this phone number last week. Where is it? It takes you 10 minutes to even find the right medium where that, you know, where the communication happened. And that fragmentation problem of people creating all these proprietary spaces is, I think, becoming too large of a drain. Like it's sort of part of an information overload problem, right?
Yeah.
Where if you could bring your things together, you can create API interfaces, self-describing protocols that could pull all these things together into a space that you own and control and can create the UI on, and you can turn into do not disturb mode all of the communication channels at once, or, you know, like that kind of thing. That's super powerful. And I think that is going to end up winning in the end, in the long term, over any of the proprietary approaches.
Okay, okay, and that is going to be built into Scepter, which is the long-term vision of what you're starting right now with Holo and Holochain. If I go back to the Holochain platform, what for you personally is the most interesting project that can be implemented on this, or that you are guys working on maybe at the moment, or that you think it will change? And I know Matthew already discussed that the most important thing might be the whole system, that this will be the change, and he doesn't believe in the killer app, but that every app will be a little bit of a change. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I think it's fun that we're really building distributed apps that you can use. Like there's like a peer-to-peer wiki and a peer-to-peer currency and a peer-to-peer Twitter and a peer-to-peer Slack, like those kinds of things where people have been talking about running dApps on Ethereum and stuff. But in terms of actual practical usage, there's not really that much that runs there, and so the fact that we have actual practical usage ones now, they're still kind of alpha release things. Like there's rough spots in the UIs, and but at least they work. It's in terms of proof of concept, and it's great to see some of the other ideas that people are coming up with and excited about doing. But for me personally, where I feel pressure in terms of to create change in the system is actually on the monetary side, where yes, there's this bubble, this speculation bubble, because we've recreated all of the problems with the centralized money systems with the crypto money systems. Like it would be hard to make a more faithful reproduction of all of the problems of centralized money than Bitcoin. It's in fact.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's the tail is wagging the dog. The speculation. So in our mainstream economy, we have this problem of the speculative economy, stock markets and futures and trading and commodities and credit default swaps and derivatives and all this stuff now overshadows the actual productive economy that we use money for getting food, for moving around the planet, for building things, right? Like it's, and then we have to like bail out the bankers because they've over gambled on things. And that's our tax money. That's our, right? Like the productive economy is now completely overshadowed by the gambling economy that we call finance. Well, that's all that has happened in the crypto space. There's essentially almost no productive economy. There's almost no real activity in trade, work being done with the currencies. It's all speculation and gambling.
Yeah.
And it's more centralized than, for example, dollars, right, which are issued by banks, not the government. Many people are confused about this. And so there's broader range, like 94% of Bitcoin being under the control of just 5 mining pools is more centralized than the issuance of dollars being under the control of banks. And that's not an accident. That's actually a system design. Proof of work and proof of stake are both centralization algorithms. You can't have a decentralized system that runs on proof of work or proof of stake. It will move itself to becoming centralized because of Pareto effects, meaning proof of work means those who have more computing power will get more money to get more computing power, right? It's a feedback loop where the rich keep getting richer. Same thing with proof of stake. If I have more money to gamble with, I have more influence, so I can get more money to gamble with, right? They're both centralizing algorithms, and they're what's being used for consensus. You're not going to end up with a decentralized system, not after you iterate, because it centralizes power. And as long as people are pretending they're getting a decentralized system by using these centralizing consensus algorithms, they're not going to end up in the right place. And So, and that's what I mean by Bitcoin is reproducing all of the problems. You know,
Yeah.
like it used to be you could mine it on your laptop and there was like anybody could be a peer. Now it's really expensive to get in and compete with big mining pools. It's the centralization of power. Same thing that is the case in our money system. It's artificially scarce. It's, you know, it's volatile. It's speculative. It's like all of these things where if you were to design a currency that you actually want to run an economy on, those are not how you want it to be. So
Okay.
what we're doing with Holo is a
Yes.
completely different currency model. It is not coin-centric, it's agent-centric. So you can't create coins by fiat, and I know this drives the Bitcoiners crazy too, because fiat means just to create from nothing, to speak into being. And that's how coins are created, from nothing,
Exactly.
being. And yet they call the national currencies fiat, which is also true. But then they created fiat cryptocurrencies and pretend that because they're crypto, they're not fiat. But they are, unless somebody gets debited, right? So when we were doing an ICO this week, right? When we launch Holo and we credit people's accounts for what they bought in the ICO, we get debited. Our balance goes down for whatever else gets credited. So we actually end up in debt for what we were funded, which kind of makes sense. It has us be accountable, right?
Yes.
But the point of the currency, though, like that's one interesting part of the design, because what it also means is there's a completely stable supply. The amount of currency in circulation is always one number, 0. Every negative balance offsets the positive balances, right? There's always 0 in the system. The system is always in balance, which makes it more stable than when you're trying to manage supplies that are non-zero. But the active supply, in terms of what's actually circulating, is a function of credit limits. And so you can actually build algorithms for self-adjusting credit limits that allow the supply to breathe, to expand and contract, so that you can, to actual market demand, so that you can have a more stable ecosystem, a more stable value currency over time. Not to mention that those credit limits, in the case of Holo, are tied to the asset. They're tied to the asset of computing power. And just like an ecosystem has a productive capacity, right? It has a regenerative capacity. If you extract resources from this ecosystem at a certain rate, it will renew. If you extract at a greater rate, you're now cutting into the productive capacity of the ecosystem and diminishing its rate of renewal, right? So we are actually designing cryptocurrencies based on the productive capacity of the ecosystem so that we can have the supply be coupled to its renewal rate, right? Its actual productive capacity. That's not being done anywhere in this space. And so for me, the pressing thing to get out there is Holo is a cryptocurrency backed by the asset of computing power. We want to get one out there backed by energy and kilowatts, backed by food, backed by housing, backed by transportation, where people can provide the asset that backs the value of the currency, but the currency is always grounded in something that is connected to real human needs. It's not a gambling market. And that, when the supply of the currency is coupled to the productive capacity of these things that meet real human needs, you can still have speculation and gambling, but in this case, the tail doesn't wag the dog, right? They don't change the supply by doing that. The supply is still coupled to the stability of the resource. So as the Holo network grows with more and more hosts, the capacity grows to issue more supply. It's not about gambling. And if the demand for it goes down because somebody builds one better than us and ours starts shrinking, then our supply also starts shrinking, which also keeps it value stable, right? So this is the way you build resilient systems for stable economies. And I think because I think that the mainstream economy is it's structured, the mainstream currencies are structured as a Ponzi scheme, and all Ponzi schemes collapse when they reach their limits of growth. And we are right at those limits, and we are nearing the collapse of essentially global currencies and probably nation states with new and better ways of organizing ourselves. If we don't have some of these real crypto economic tools tied into real human needs before those things collapse, I think we're in pretty big trouble. I think that's the thing that makes this so imperative, is that we actually get these things out here to get a foundation for a real peer-to-peer crypto economy that's decentralized.
That's very interesting. And I like the way that you said it in this way. Everything that I hear about your organization kind of supports this claim. When I've been to the Holo meetups, I realized that the people working with us were not the typical blockchain people, but they were much nicer and much more caring, and actually very interested in sustainability. And you mentioned that you're doing an ICO, which you're not calling initial coin offering, but initial community offering, and you take on the debts on what people are buying in. So you're taking on a huge risk. So can I say this is your personal motivation to take on this failing system and actually trying to save us before everything is crashing? You know, in case the economy is crashing, would Holo provide a sustainable, and Holochain provide a sustainable alternative where people can, let's say, flee into to keep stability and balance alive?
Yeah, I mean, that is really our hope, that and the reason Holo has to come first before electricity, housing, food, those types of things, is that all of those actually have to run on the computing infrastructure that Holo creates.
Yes.
Right. So for us, this is kind of a strategic sequence of events of like, how do you build the foundation for a new crypto economy? It feels to me like if we can get these kinds of structures in place, that they're very resilient, they're very stable and solid. Part of what we're trying to learn in the process of launching Holo is like, what are the equilibriums and the feedback loops for how to interface with national currencies and cryptocurrencies, and like, how do you create stable value, and how do you create the right supply formulas for the breathing supply, and and not that every one of these is going to follow the exact same algorithms and formulas, but I think we really have our eyes on how does this become a self-regulating breathing system that can sustain itself. It has its own kind of homeostasis range. It's not that it stays in one thing, but that it stays stable. And yeah, you ask about my motivation in it, and it's just kind of like, because if you can see these things, it's like, how can you not want to build them, share them, get them out there? It's like, I don't know, how can you not want to?
Because it's difficult.
The people from suffering and economic collapse, if you can see, hey, there's this healthy alternative, and I've got a team who can build it.
Yeah, basically, well, it's a very, very hard process to go there. It's very, very difficult, and you need smart people. And as you see, people who create interesting projects like the DAO could end up failing big.
Sure.
So, and you're taking on creating an alternative for huge corporation. You're taking on Amazon and eBay and Facebook and the internet itself in general. So there's an enormous amount of pressure sitting on your shoulder. And I don't want to put more pressure on you. That, but since we're running out of time, I just want to quickly wrap up. I'm really, I really admire this project that you're doing, and I'm happy to follow it around. And probably a lot of our viewers would be interested in, even if they're not developers who create dApps, how can people get in touch with your company and your organization? What can they do, and how can they contribute to making this a successful project?
We have a bunch of different ways. You can jump into our online chat, our kind of open source Slack alternative, Mattermost, at chat.holochain.org. You can read white papers at holo.host/whitepapers. We have a lot of them, actually. I mean, they're not even all there. More of them are on the Scepter site. We have like 5 or 6 white papers. There's just a lot of substantive technological stuff and systems design stuff that we're incorporating. We have an Indiegogo campaign going where we're selling Holo host boxes on Indiegogo. You can just Google Indiegogo Holo and find that. And we have an ICO coming up this week, which you have to be whitelisted for. We're really trying to upgrade some of the behaviors in the ICO space as well. We've been writing about trying to launch the ethical ICO and what that really means, how to actually reach the crowd and not have it be taken over by kind of crypto whales. And I can't say it's been without challenges. It's been challenging to do all that. Oh, but one of the really great things, sorry, just one quick aside. We've moved jurisdictions from Gibraltar to Liechtenstein. And apparently there was some scare in Liechtenstein, some ICO doing shady things last week. And there was like some feedback coming down against the regulatory authority. And we had our regulatory meeting, we had our meeting with the regulatory authority on Monday this week, and they came in all like kind of strict and fierce, and we need to, make sure things, and they were really, this is one of those cases where doing the ethical ICO, I think, really helped, because we so exceeded their expectations on how careful we were about things and how clearly we thought through and designed things, and that they were like, wow, okay, this doesn't have any of the same concerns, and apparently they kind of pushed us up to the front of the line of projects to approve, because they were extremely comfortable with all of the steps we'd taken here. So that was one of those moments where it was like, okay, phew, good. There's like, maybe we're part of setting a new standard,
Good. Yes, I think, I'm thankful for having this interview with you. It was extremely informative and very interesting, and I thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And